Political participation and in comparative perspective. If you go out there and you read about political participation, you'll get a lot of returns for American politics because there's a very well established literature on political participation in US elections. And those insights are useful, but studying political participation in comparative perspective is different because we're interested in the differences across countries that might influence voting behavior by citizens. And so then that makes us focus more on things like economic development and democratic institutions. It makes us think about cultural differences that might matter. These are the types of variables that are a little bit larger in scope than a lot of the factors that are taken into consideration in studies of American political behavior. Nevertheless, there is a lot of crossover, and so we benefit from those studies. And I think that American political behavior benefits from comparative politics too. But today, we're going to be focusing on comparative politics and political participation in comparative perspective. So then we'll focus on different forms of political participation, those being passive and active forms of participation. We'll define political participation by talking about how precisely we can characterize what we mean and how we know it when we see it. And then finally, we will engage in sort of an analysis, or we'll review a sort of analysis of variation in voting participation from country to country. And this is an exercise ultimately in a larger, more quantitative analysis. We'll review a study that assessed voting behavior in 29 democracies. So normally we focus on a set of cases that's quite small. In this case, we benefit from looking at a larger data set and a larger analysis. This is a picture of a protest in New York City, right around the time that Congress was debating the tax law passed under the Trump administration a couple years ago. You'll see signs that say tax scam, that associate Trump with Russia. And you see a lot of dissatisfied people. They look like ordinary people, like the ones who probably didn't benefit from a lot of the tax cuts in that bill that was ultimately passed. And this is an example of political participation. These people are actively coming together in opposition to a specific piece of legislation being debated by the Congress and that would likely be passed and ultimately signed into law. This is a form of participation that is quite active and that involves people coming together and mobilizing in opposition to something, but they could just as easily be mobilizing in support of something. And in fact, we could give you examples of moments when people come together in support of a decision or an outcome. But more often and increasingly, people are coming together in opposition to some situation or state of the world. We could think about protests against racial injustice. We can think about protests against police brutality. All of these are recent examples that would count as examples of political participation. The definition of political participation, it's a difficult nut to crack because there's a lot of debate about what constitutes political participation and whether different forms of participation are equally political and equally important whenever we consider different types of behavior by individuals or groups. But the starting point for all of these discussions is the acknowledgement that political rights include the right to participate in politics. The Freedom House Index, remember, focuses on civil liberties and political rights. One of those rights is, broadly speaking, the right to participate in politics through things like voting or protest or assembly or petitioning or letter writing and so on and so forth. There are an infinite number of different examples of political participation, but all of them we can associate with political rights or an entitlement to some, potential behavior or some type of activity that one could engage in. But in comparative politics, we're not just interested in types of behavior and in types of activity. Participation can mean different things in different contexts. And comparative politics makes us focus on those variations and those differences in those different contexts. And when we focus on those different contexts, we begin to see that there are important cultural differences. There are important differences in terms of common practices or norms of activity or behavior that influence the choices that people make. And what is normal in one context might not be normal in another. And what is very common and ordinary in one place may not be common in another. And in the simplest example, we can talk about how voting is extraordinarily common in some countries where voter participation rates are as high as 90%, but less common in others. In countries like Honduras, where they go as low as 40 to 50%, in the United States for that matter. But the point is that there are important differences from country to country. At this point, I'd like to pause and just get your pulse and ask you, what are some examples of political participation? What are some common examples, or what are some important examples that we should think about?
I think that political participation can mean involvement in such as protests or like freedom of speech, like basically the freedom of speech aspects, or like in different countries, it might be like basically protesting to kind of showcase an issue or kind of showcase concerns of its citizens.
Efren, do you think that protest is like an especially effective form of participation?
Yeah, I believe that it's like an effective because it like in countries that like it creates movements. Like people are saying like it creates movements. It creates like a historical like impact and its um like government, and so it can like possibly, even though um there's possibilities that cannot like some things that cannot happen, but it still makes an impact for like generations to come.
Yeah, there's something visible about a protest. In what's more, the size of the protest often can compel the authorities to respond in some way, and that can expose them, and it can bring criticism upon them and lend support to the movement. Protest does matter and it does work. We'll talk in a moment about some examples of successful protest. What are some other examples of political participation? Dorian says signing petitions, especially in California, right, with the proposition process and how widely it is used. The ballot measures are very commonly used, and there are entire industries devoted to mobilizing people to get signatures. It's a big business as well as an important activity politically. Going out to vote, obviously very important. Manuel says voting, protests, voicing concerns. And Martha says political movements. Absolutely. Bigger movements, right? Like Black Lives Matter is a movement. It is not an organization. It is sort of an amorphous movement, a kind of constellation of different movements or groups who share a common objective. But it's a movement in the sense that it's sort of self-perpetuating and it's kind of institutionalized almost. And it's something that could probably stand the test of time. Running for office, that's definitely political participation. I think that when we talk about participation, we're often thinking about ordinary citizens, right? People who aren't in politics, but who are participating in the process in a variety of ways. So maybe when you run for office, you potentially cross the line into becoming a politician, and you're now, a part of the process. Participation might mean, the activities of citizens, but certainly citizens often choose to run because they become motivated to do so for reasons that relate to their experience. And so, for instance, women have been running in larger numbers for elected office in the United States and elsewhere, because increasingly women's rights issues are not just under a threat, but they're also increasingly important because of the growing strength of feminist movements. So for a variety of reasons, people do run for office when they initially don't think of themselves maybe as politicians. And that's obviously the case with women politicians, who often come into politics from walks of life that are very different. So AOC is a good example. How do forms of political participation vary across countries? So this is an important question, because what's normal here might not be normal elsewhere. And the thing about comparative politics is that we have to be able to travel and see those differences and understand how political participation can be meaningful in one case, but less meaningful in another, unless some of the differences are accounted for. And so this is a photo from Hong Kong, where students occupied universities during the wave of protests against Chinese control of Hong Kong in the past few years. This was an important moment because it signaled both the resilience of the student movement, and it exposed the violence of the security forces against the students. And this was an important example of political participation, because they were mobilizing resistance to the status quo, and they were signaling opposition to an extradition bill in particular, which would have given China the power to essentially extradite Hong Kong citizens to China for prosecution. Now, eventually, the Hong Kong parliament withdrew the bill, and that ended China's potential control of China, of Hong Kong in this moment. So it's still at issue, but political participation in Hong Kong has often meant mass protest and engagement in civil disobedience, like occupations of universities and other institutions. Occupations have also been really important in Chile, where the feminist movement in particular have taken over dozens of campuses over the years during moments of acute protest of sexual assault. And their demands have often been very, very articulate and very precise. And so, for example, they have often called for justice for Chilean women, and in particular, legislation and bills designed to protect women's rights and protect them from gender-based violence and discrimination. So this is a photo from a university where the feminist movement had taken over and occupied for weeks at a time in 2018. This is a photo of the Tunisian Revolution. The Tunisian Revolution is a good example of mass protest. Let me pause for a moment, everyone. I'm going to grab my kid, and he's a little bit loud right now. Hey, buddy. So the Tunisian Revolution is a really good example of mass collective action to remove a dictatorship and set in motion an eventual democratic transition. This is behavior that might not be well understood from our perspective, even though in all truth, the United States began with its own revolution, but it's political participation nonetheless. And it's a good example of how masses can become so critical to political outcomes. Okay. So political participation does mean voting, and voting is the most fundamental act after all, but it's not limited to voting. It can mean so much more than just voting. It does mean voting, but it might also mean campaigning at the local, the state, or the national level. It might mean engaging in grassroots campaigns for politicians or ballot measures. It might mean mobilizing activists against certain policy measures like nuclear power, or mobilizing Native Americans against pipelines in the Midwest, in South Dakota, in Nebraska, which has been an ongoing critical issue that affects people and their livelihoods on the ground in those places. It might mean occupying a university in still another case when accusations of sexual assault mobilize feminist movements to demand legislation to protect women's rights and protect women against gender-based violence. And what all these activities have in common is that they are intended to bring about some specific outcome. They are examples of concerted action. Participation is concerted action. It is direct action. It can be indirect, and there are forms of passive participation. But what all of these activities have in common is that they hold up some specific objective, or they are intended to bring about some specific outcome. And more narrowly, they're intended to mobilize support for or against the government, some specific policy, or some particular decision. And so we can begin to define political participation based on these different sketches and these different examples that we've given in this different sets, this different analysis that we've come to. And we can define political participation as individual or collective action at the national, regional, or local level that supports or opposes state structures, authorities, and or policies. This is a definition that accounts for the possibility that individuals are the main actors, collectivities are the main actors, that is groups of people or groups of people, that the action takes place at the national level, the regional level, the local level, that it is in support of a policy, in opposition to a policy, in support of an institution or an authority, or in opposition to an institution and an authority. In all of these different possibilities, there's always some support or opposition at some particular level by some political actor. And this is the essence of political participation. And this participation, moreover, can be verbal or written, it can be violent or nonviolent, and it can be of any intensity. This definition is all-encompassing, and it is an inclusive definition. One of the key debates in comparative politics has been about whether definitions of political participation should incorporate active as well as passive forms, and if violent behavior and disobedient behavior should also be included. And there's a new consensus that it should be included. And in truth, not including it would exclude a variety of different examples of political behavior that become consequential for good or for ill. And so violent and disobedient behavior are both examples of behavior in participation that are increasingly parts of definitions. And of course, disobedience and violence are two very different types of behavior, but they are types of behavior that haven't always been included in definitions of participation. So one of the first issues that arises when we define political participation is how we distinguish between passive and active forms of participation, and whether we distinguish between them, and whether we include passive as well as active forms. And passive forms of participation are very different than active forms. Passive forms really relate to political attitudes and sentiments. So like patriotism, feelings of political alienation, feelings of apathy or indifference. These relate to sentiments and feelings or sensibilities that people have about politics. And in some ways, these forms of participation are latent, but in some other ways, they are more overt. And so, for example, people who fly flags from their vehicles or put bumper stickers on their cars or express various senses of patriotism or feelings of alienation or feelings of indifference or feelings of aggressive hostility or whatever it is that they feel regarding politics or government. And so what this relates to and more generally is thinking about politics and how you feel or relate to politics, and whether you are patriotic or nationalistic or progressive or conservative, and so on and so forth. There's also the dimension of political awareness and your attention to politics in the media. And so from this perspective, it's about whether you engage on a sort of literate level, and whether you are consuming media about politics, and whether you are relating to politics in this kind of way. These are passive forms of participation. They are in no way active or involved or direct. You might even dispute that they are forms of participation at all, because they might be subconscious or might be undeveloped or latent. But they nevertheless are forms of passive participation in the sense that they don't directly involve behavior or involve direct choice or activity. But on the other hand, there are active forms of participation that are much more direct and much more intentional and much more chosen. And these relate to agency and independence and choice. The first and the most obvious example is civil disobedience. And civil disobedience brings us to some of the best known examples of all time. And those are examples from the civil rights movement. This is a picture of the Asian American movement engaging in civil disobedience in the 70s and in I think the late 60s too. Maybe it's the late 60s. I'm not exactly sure the year of this photo. But civil disobedience has a very long and cherished history as a form of active political participation, often in opposition to the status quo and in demanding the creation of new political rights or civil liberties for disenfranchised groups. Political violence is also an example of active political participation. We'll talk about the formation of paramilitaries and guerrilla groups in Colombia here in a moment as an example of political violence. Efforts to change the government, like in Tunisia, where they sought to bring about a regime transition, that's an example of active political participation. There are efforts to maintain a government that can be thought of as forms of active political participation. And for instance, this might be a bit of a stretch, but it is an example. Some private supporters of Donald Trump have introduced lawsuits to challenge the integrity of the 2020 presidential election. They have levied these cases on behalf of Donald Trump, but they have done so as private actors. And so this can be viewed as an active form of political participation, this effort to maintain a government by disputing the election results. And then, of course, behavior mobilized by the state. A good example is mandated meetings in North Korea, where the totalitarian regime requires citizens to cut their hair in a certain way, to attend meetings on the weekends, to engage actively in mobilization exercises where they have to get out into the streets and engage in marches and so on and so forth. This behavior is very active and very intentional and very directly mobilized by the state. It is active participation, but different from these other types of active participation. This is a photo of rebels of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, as they're often referred to. This is them at the very end of their insurgency, which was recently brought to sort of a fragile end through a peace deal with the government. But their decades-long insurgency and armed rebellion is an example of political violence, which is an active form of political participation. This is a form of participation that's somewhat alien to us now because obviously we've lived in relative peace for centuries in this country. But in Colombia, the Civil War is still very much a part of daily life because the people there still live with conflict as well as the legacies of conflict. And so participation looks different a little bit everywhere. And in Colombia, it has meant armed uprising and armed insurgency from multiple groups, not just the FARC, but also the ELN and some other groups. In Hong Kong, mass protests have been an integral part of the larger sort of pro-democracy movement and opposition to the extradition bill and more generally Chinese control and influence in the country. As I mentioned, that extradition bill was ultimately withdrawn, and the umbrella movement, as it's been called, has been very successful in winning some concessions and in maintaining at least some autonomy, or at least resisting the imposition of new measures that would strengthen Chinese control. We'll watch in a moment a video, well, we'll watch it right now actually, a video that really does a nice job illustrating the demands of the protesters as well as depict the situation in Hong Kong and the potential change if the bill had gone through.
因為我哋已經冇晒退路，我哋太多嘅妥協啦，所以更加要俾佢哋睇到香港人嘅決心。
The people of Hong Kong are out in the streets.
呢個遊行對香港嘅未來可以話係歷史性嘅一刻咯，係香港。
Hundreds of thousands are demonstrating against a deeply unpopular bill.
呢個會影響全香港嘅市民，
因為呢條條例對香港嘅傷害係非常之大嘅。
But this is about a whole lot more than a bill. It's about the status of Hong Kong and the power China has over it. It's a fight to preserve the freedoms people have here, and it all started with a murder. On February 8, 2018, a young couple, Chan Tong-kai and Poon Hyo-wing, went from their home in Hong Kong to Taiwan for vacation. They stayed at the Purple Garden Hotel in Taipei for 9 days. But on February 17th, only one of them returned to Hong Kong. There, 1 month later, Chan confessed to murdering his girlfriend, who was pregnant at the time. But there was a problem. Hong Kong authorities couldn't charge him for murder because he did it in Taiwan, and they couldn't send him back to Taiwan to be charged because Hong Kong and Taiwan don't have an extradition agreement. So in 2019, Hong Kong's government proposed one. It would let them transfer suspects to Taiwan so they could be tried for their crimes. But the same bill would also allow extradition to mainland China,
where there's no fair trial, there's no humane punishment, and there's completely no separation of powers.
And that's what sparked these protests. China and Hong Kong are two very different places with a very complex political relationship, and the extradition bill threatens to give China more power over Hong Kong. See, Hong Kong is technically a part of China, but it operates as a semi-autonomous region. It all began in the late 1800s, when China lost a series of wars to Britain and ended up ceding Hong Kong for a period of 99 years. Hong Kong remained a British colony until 1997, when Britain gave it back to China under a special agreement. It was called One Country, Two Systems. It made Hong Kong a part of China, but it also said that Hong Kong would retain a high degree of autonomy, as well as democratic freedoms, like the right to vote, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, of assembly. And that made Hong Kong very different from mainland China, which is authoritarian. Citizens there don't have the same freedoms. Its legal system is often used to arrest, punish, and silence people who speak out against the state. But according to the agreement, one country, two systems wouldn't last forever. In 2047, Hong Kong is expected to fully become a part of China. The problem is, China isn't waiting for the deal to expire. Under the rule of Chinese leader Xi Jinping, pro-democracy leaders have already been arrested in Hong Kong, and mysterious abductions of booksellers have created a threat to free speech. But Hong Kong has been pushing back. In 2003, 500,000 Hong Kongers successfully fought legislation that would have punished speaking out against China. And in 2014, tens of thousands of protesters occupied the city for weeks to protest China's influence over Hong Kong's elections. Now, Hong Kongers are fighting the extradition bill because the bill is widely seen as the next step in China's encroachment on Hong Kong's autonomy.
因為我哋對呢個中國嘅法律係冇信心。
任何一個市民如果係大陸政權，佢係唔中意你，佢可以用一個任何嘅理由。
如果那说难听点，如果他们条例通过，那就代表香港沦陷。
The sheer size of these protests shows you just how much opposition there is to this bill. But if Hong Kong's legislature votes on the bill, it'll probably pass. And that's because of the unique nature of Hong Kong's democracy. For starters, Hong Kong's people don't vote for their leader. The chief executive is selected by a small committee and approved by China. And even though they're the head of the government, they don't make the laws. That happens here. Like many democracies, Hong Kong has a legislature with democratically elected representatives. It's called the Legislative Council, or LegCo, and it has 70 seats. Within this system, Hong Kong has many political parties, but they are mostly either pro-democracy or pro-China. In every election, Hong Kong's pro-democracy and anti-establishment parties have won the popular vote, but they occupy less than half of the seats in the LegCo. This is because when Hong Kongers vote, they're only voting for these 40 of the 70 seats. The other 30 are chosen by the various business communities of Hong Kong. For example, one seat belongs to the finance industry, one seat belongs to the medical industry, one belongs to the insurance industry, and so on. Many of these 30 seats are voted on by corporations. And because big business has an incentive to be friendly with China, those seats are dominated by pro-China political parties. When Hong Kong was handed over to China in 1997, Hong Kong and China made an agreement that eventually all members of the council would be elected by the people. But that never happened, and ever since the handoff, pro-China parties have controlled the LegCo, despite having never won more than 50% of the popular vote.
The way it's structured, they want to make sure that the executive branch can have easy control over it, and that would serve Beijing very well indeed.
Within this unique structure, the extradition bill has created new tensions and fueled anger among pro-democracy politicians, and it's driven hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers into the streets.
其实民主的基础本来就是建立在人民上，所以大家都走出来，那你还能不重视这个事件吗？
While this isn't Hong Kong's first protest against China's influence, it is the biggest. And many say this time is different because of the people involved. Professionals like lawyers and politicians are participating.
Our legal sector staged the biggest ever protest parade.
But it's young people who are at the forefront, since they have the most to lose. They are the first generation born under one country, two systems, and in 28 years, when that arrangement ends, they'll be Hong Kong's professional class.
I won't be around anymore. It's their future. It's their Hong Kong. They have every right to fight it.
佢哋出嚟係唔係為咗自己，佢係為咗成個香港嘅未來。
好感動，真係好感動。
The protests have convinced Hong Kong's government to suspend the bill, but that's not enough. Many want the bill withdrawn completely. That's because these protests are also part of a larger fight to push back against China's encroachment now, not just when time's up.
其實唔使2047年啦，我話俾你聽。其實你而家見到大陸政府其實一路已經將嗰條線推前，所以大家只係想為自己原本擁有嘅權利去出嚟遊行咯。我哋仲有好多機會去改變。
2047 is on its way, but it's not here yet. And until then, Hong Kongers still have a voice.
History will tell whether we succeed. But even if we failed, history would say they did put up a fight and they didn't just take things lying down. And that's what we're trying to do too.
So I stand corrected. The bill was suspended. It was not withdrawn. But this video is really insightful because it shows you that one of the reasons that political participation varies from country to country is that the institutions and the systems themselves vary. And so what is even permissible behavior varies. In Hong Kong, when they vote, they only vote for about half of the legislature. They can't elect the rest of the parliament because those seats are reserved for different industries who have incentives to align with China because of their economic interests. That means then that they don't have democracy there and they can't express themselves and exercise their full political and civil liberty to behave and participate in a democracy. They don't really have a truly competitive system. And so in that kind of scenario, mass protest becomes one of the only available channels for expressing dissatisfaction with a new potential policy or a bill, which in this case was the extradition bill. And so in Hong Kong, participation looks a little bit different than it does in the United States, where mass protest has never been a civic tradition, maybe with the exception of the civil rights movement. But even during the civil rights movement, it was really more targeted, and it was often disenfranchised groups and their allies who would engage in protest. Mass protest then could be understood as maybe a distinctive form of participation in Hong Kong. Of course, the most democratic and the most important of all forms of participation is the vote. And after all, it is voting that the Hong Kongers aspire to and want to engage in more fully and more effectively. And when they demand democracy, what they're demanding is the power to vote to elect all of the representatives of the parliament, and moreover, to be able to vote for representatives who represent them in a system that is not beholden to China more generally. This is a photo of Election Day in Mexico, where elections are also the chief and primary means of exercising civil rights and liberties in that democracy. And in July 2018, Mexico had an election for president. And in Mexico, elections have long been an important means of connecting voters to the policy process. The integrity of the elections has not always been up to par, but the vote, nevertheless, is the chief and primary means of exercising control and behaving and participating in politics. So the vote then is one way of assessing variation in participation from country to country. Why do some countries vote at higher levels than others? Why is voter turnout higher in some countries and lower than others? And the question of why voting participation varies is one question that's been addressed most commonly in comparative politics. And it's one question that we can address ourselves to try to assess and understand why countries vary in terms of these key forms of participation. When we talk about participation, one of the challenges is assessing it from country to country. When there is such important variation in terms of the core means and forms of participation, how do you engage in an analysis when it's oranges in one country and apples in another? Well, one way we can do that is by just focusing on voting and just assuming that voting is relatively important everywhere the democratic institutions exist. And so this is our starting point here. We'll focus on voting, and we'll use the measure voter turnout. This is going to be our indicator, and we'll define that as the percentage of the eligible voters who actually voted in national elections. Typically in the United States, presidential elections have brought out between 50 and 55% of eligible voters. I think this year it was actually significantly higher, although I don't know what the precise turnout was. If anyone knows what that was, drop it in the chat. We'd like to know that. But this is the measure that we'll use. We'll use voter turnout as the key measure for comparing countries. And what we'll do is we'll examine several key hypotheses on why voter participation varies. And these hypotheses are some of the leading perspectives in comparative politics, some of the leading explanations of variation in voter participation. I'll check the comments. I think someone has the turnout already. Kevin says about 66.6%. That's very high for US elections, very high. I think that's the highest turnout in many years. Highest since 1910. Wow. Thanks, Kevin. So we'll examine several key hypotheses that come from the literature on voter participation in comparative politics. The first one comes from modernization theory. This is something we're already familiar with, the role of economic development in shaping politics. The hypothesis here is pretty straightforward. More developed countries will have higher levels of turnout, and we'll measure development in terms of per capita income, right? So basically just income level on an individual basis. So countries with higher levels of economic development should bring out more people to the polls, all else things being equal. Countries with representative institutions should have higher levels of voter turnout. So representative legislatures and other forms of democratic institutions should bring people to the polls. Pretty straightforward. Electoral laws that facilitate voting, like mandatory voting, or laws that help people get the day off or get excused from work to vote, these should bring people to the polls. These are sort of like institutional drivers of voter turnout. Also, relatively straightforward and consistent with some of the institutional perspectives on comparative politics that we've already discussed in the course. And then finally, there's an important role potentially for party systems with parties that have strong ties to groups in society. And so this really relates to how institutionalized the parties are and how well connected they are to social groups like unions and other organizations. Some parties in some countries even have union-based parties or business class parties. These are examples of parties that are going to be very well connected to social groups in society. The idea is that these types of party systems should bring people to the polls at higher rates. And then, of course, the other side of all of these hypotheses would work the other way. So less developed countries should have lower levels of turnout. Countries with less representative institutions should have lower levels of turnout. Countries without electoral laws that facilitate voting, that is, countries that lack holidays for voting and that lack mandatory voting laws, should have lower levels of turnout. And then finally, countries with less connected or less well-established or socially based party systems should have lower levels of turnout. So the secondary literature shows us that when these factors are analyzed and when other factors are controlled for, there's significant support for all of these different hypotheses. And that's consistent with what we know about the role of economic development already and what we know about the role of strong party systems already. But there's really more to the story. It's not that development and representative institutions by themselves drive people to the polls. These are actually structural conditions that work to foster strong party systems and then electoral laws that facilitate voting. And so economic development in institutions do matter. It's just that they sort of create a kind of scaffolding that supports party systems and then voting laws and legislation and other components that help to drive people to the polls. Then the converse is also true. Less developed countries that have less representative institutions should have weaker party systems and should have less permissive voting laws. And in turn, they should have lower levels of voter turnout. This is sort of consistent with what we understand about political and economic development more generally. This is very much in keeping with what we know about these types of factors and these types of causes. And so if we take a look at these different drivers, and if we depict them sort of graphically, it looks something like this, where we have the 4 hypotheses on voting participation, ultimately driving voting participation. All of these different factors are favorably or positively related to voter turnout. So countries with higher levels of economic development should have more democratic or more representative institutions, should then in turn have stronger party systems with strong party society alignments. They should also in turn have more favorable voting laws like voting holidays and mandatory voting. And ultimately they should have higher levels of voter participation. And so this is consistent with our understanding of how economic development affects politics. That understanding was informed by modernization theory, which is one of the largest and broadest perspectives on democratization and on politics and comparative politics. When you look at this figure, do you disagree with any parts of it? Or do you think that any part of this is overstated? Do you think that this misses anything, or that there's any aspect of it that doesn't accurately depict reality as you understand it? Or do you think that this figure misses anything else that might be part of the picture? Kevin says, maybe the figure underplays the role of culture. I was thinking about that. So what about, for example, civic culture? In a kind of political culture that really promotes participation in elections. The example of India is a really good example. India has a relatively low level of economic development, but they have really high levels of voter turnout. Why? And how can we understand this from the perspective of this figure from Powell? Well, one way we can understand it is that India has a really robust civic culture, and they really promote voting across all different social classes and sectors. And they do so in a very supportive way by creating polling places and polling processes and procedures for everyone, including the disabled and the handicapped. There's one polling place in the forest of Gujarat that serves a single voter. They created a polling place for a single voter. But the point is that India is an example of how a very poor country can have very high levels of turnout despite not having a high level of economic development. And I think the role of culture and civic culture then is quite important in the case of India. Kevin suggests that culture might be important. It's possible also that a high level of economic development might not produce or coincide with a civic culture, and maybe voting participation is relatively low as a result. And in this class, we've actually questioned whether there is a robust civic culture in the United States still today. In the past, the US has been considered an example of a very robust civic culture, but it's not necessarily clear that that still is the case, because voter turnout is quite low, for one, but more importantly, maybe there's increasing polarization in tolerating dissenting views and opposing views is less and less valued as a sort of part of politics in the process. And so it could be that in the United States, low levels of voter turnout, even despite high levels of economic development, can be explained by the relative absence or the breakdown or the erosion of a civic culture that could be also important as a driver of voter turnout in a place like India, where economic development is relatively low. So I think that civic culture is probably very, very important. The challenge, though, is how do we really change civic culture? How do we promote that actively, but maybe how do we also measure it, and how do we detect changes in culture? Culture is famously hard to study, and it can also be prone to bias, and it can unfortunately perpetuate stereotypes in some cases too. Culture has always been sort of a controversial issue or sort of perspective in comparative politics for that reason. But nevertheless, I think that civic culture is probably very important to this picture, even though it's not really captured here. What else does this miss? Is there anything else that you think is important that is not accounted for here in this this figure? Anna Martha says maybe institutions. So I think that might be accounted for by representational constitution. But I think that Anna Martha, there's a role for the quality of the institutions, right? And maybe the strength of the institutions. And that's not accounted for here. And in Latin America, for example, voter turnout is relatively low in a lot of democracies because, for one, well, they're relatively underdeveloped economically. Some places, like countries like Honduras, where voter turnout is relatively low, we might be able to understand that low level of turnout by pointing to economic development. But there might also be a role for weak institutions and relatively weak state institutions, in the strength and the quality of those institutions, and how that informs or influences the views that people have of democracy and in their self-efficacy and their role in the process and whether their vote really counts. So, for example, corruption is rampant in Honduras, and many people don't believe that the democratic process really fairly and accurately represents a response to them, and that the weakness of the institutions then doesn't really mean that their vote is meaningful or that it is an effective tool, or that they're really a part of the process. And so I think that the strength or the weakness of the institutions and the quality of them, and how vulnerable they are to corruption, or how vulnerable they are to breakdown or crisis, can also affect turnout. In Peru, for instance, when the party system collapsed in the 1990s, voter turnout was one variable that was affected. People lost faith in the traditional parties, and they lost faith in traditional institutions, and they increasingly supported authoritarian alternatives, and they increasingly withdrew from the process as well. And so voter turnout is a variable that's affected by a lot of different factors, probably not all of which are captured by this schematic here. Institutions, in Guatemala too, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good example. Guatemala is a country that increasingly is authoritarian in its regime type because of abuses of power by the executive and because of limits to competition in elections. And this is a place where voter turnout is also relatively low, and people protest a lot or increasingly in Guatemala because of their perception that the democracy and the institutions are failing and not working. And so, yeah, the Central American countries are a good example of low levels of turnout and weakness in the democratic institutions and weak institutions. So as we begin to think more and more about the big picture in political participation, I want to pose a series of questions that help us to think about political participation and the differences between different forms of participation. And these questions are as follows. First, in what ways other than voting can people participate in politics? And which ones are electoral and which ones are not? Second, why don't more people vote in the United States? What factors keep people out of the electoral process? And then third, are some forms of participation more effective than others? I think that all of these questions are really useful as a guide and as sort of a starting point, but I want to encourage us to think about the different forms of participation and if some of them are more effective than others. And maybe one good place to start is a poll. And I want to create a poll based on this question that I'll give you here in a moment. All right, everyone, I'm launching a poll. The question is, all else being equal, is voting or protesting more effective in bringing about change? And I'd like you to answer, and we can have a discussion about the effectiveness of these different forms of participation. And maybe we can draw on our discussion of Hong Kong and some of these other cases. It's a really close race. "21 of 28 have voted." It's going to be close. Take a few more seconds while the last votes roll in as we count the mail-in ballots. If you haven't voted, I encourage you to participate in this democratic process and cast your ballot. 2 more votes remain uncast, and I'm telling you, it's really close. 1 more remains uncast. And we cannot yet call this, the AP cannot call this election because the outstanding votes could change the outcome. There's one left. I think that some of the contenders might want to dispute this result and use all available legal options. They may demand a recount. There's one more vote left out there. We'd like to hear from that last voter. We'll even give you a sticker if you participate. Give you a sticker. All right, well, I'm gonna call it because I'd like us to discuss this. I'll end the poll, and 27 of us have voted, and I'm gonna share the results. All else being equal, is voting or protesting more effective in bringing about change? 14 of you, or 52%, said protesting is more effective. 13 of you, or 48%, said voting is more effective. And this is a really interesting question because it gets to a larger question about whether different forms of political participation are created equal, and whether one comes at the expense of the other or if they complement each other. Now, obviously, you don't have to choose between them. We can vote and protest. But the question of whether protesting is more effective than voting is important because it makes us think about how to spend our precious time and money and resources. And so let's discuss this a little bit. Those of you who say that protesting is more effective, can you talk a little bit about why protesting is more effective?
Can I?
Of course, Anna Martha.
Okay, maybe protest is a long time participation and requires more effort and sacrifice for all the people, but eventually we can get a social change in the future because we have to press the rules that we don't want to continue, and we can throw away a president also. Like Filipinas.
Absolutely, Anna Martha. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
Oh no, because I was remember the case in Filipinas. They throw away the presidents just for protesting in the social movements.
Yeah, that would be the example of Marcos in the removal of.
Yes.
That's a great example. And that's exactly right. What the research shows is that protest is effective because it's sustained, it's large in scope, and it can bring support to the cause of change if protest leads the state to use repression, which can often bring others from the outside to critique the state and to support the protesters. And so the example of the Philippines is a really good example where they brought about regime change in the removal of the dictator Marcos in the inauguration of a democratic regime. Mass protests are useful for this reason because of their size and their scope, and oftentimes how sustained they can be and how they can alter the balance of power and bring criticism upon the ruling regime, and they can bring support upon their own cause by usually forcing the hand of the regime in leading them to use drastic measures to try to retain control of the situation. Now, voting, on the other hand, is obviously important. You can remove a leader through voting, but think about, for example, authoritarian regimes where elections aren't competitive, or they aren't fair, or they're rigged, or the outcome is predetermined because the electoral authority is controlled by the incumbent authoritarian regime. In that situation, voting doesn't really do much good protest might be especially important in the example of the Philippines under Marcos, or also in the example of Chile in the 1970s, the 1980s, really in any Latin American country in the 1970s and the 80s, with the exception of Venezuela and Colombia. So protest is going to be more important in situations where authoritarian rule is in place, and maybe voting is more important in situations where the democracy is truly competitive and the institutions are representative and the outcomes are meaningful. But even in a democracy, we can consider a role for protest if the democracy itself is not sufficiently representative of all of the different sectors of society. So what about, you know, women and LGBTQT and non-gender conforming and trans people and the various groups who are not effectively represented or protected by the rights and liberties that the rest of us enjoy? We can imagine that there's a role for protest by these groups, even in a democratic system where voting is otherwise considered the main means of influencing the government. And so I think it depends on the situation, right? But we know that protest is meaningful when it can bring criticism upon the ruling government and lend support to the protest movement. Manuel says protesting has the potential to raise concern about issues that would have gone otherwise unaddressed. I think on balance, protests are more effective because it brings an issue to popularity. By voting, there is potential for change, but how can a problem be addressed if the issue isn't given priority in the first place? Yeah, so if your vote doesn't successfully get something on the agenda, protesting can help to move the goalposts, right? You can exert pressure and you can increase the costs for politicians of not incorporating your concerns. And so this is often how protests have been successful. The civil rights movement, the movement to extend the vote to women, women's rights movements, all of these are examples of protest movements that had to successfully get their concern on the agenda before any vote could be effective in making a decision, right? So even if something is on the agenda, you might not get enough votes to actually approve a measure that is put forward to bring about some change. And so voting as well as protest have to often work together. Jackie says, I believe there are historic elections, but after that, that's it. There are not revolutions that happens through voting. Elites have power and education of the people. They control the police, military, media. You can make minor changes through voting, but you cannot bring significant change with simply voting, especially if change short-term is needed. If voting and or public opinion was enough to bring about change, life would be 10 times easier. Yeah, and I think that the case of Hong Kong is a good example, right? They vote, right? But they don't vote for the full legislature. They can only elect fewer than half of the representatives. And so protest becomes important because only through protest can they signal their dissatisfaction with that status quo and potentially change the institutions so that in the future their vote would count for more of the actual parliament, right? They would elect the full parliament as opposed to just half of it. Stephen says, I believe protests are more effective because the protest can lead to immediate action, either for or against the movement, whereas voting has a slow release effect and can take longer for change to happen. Exactly. So the time frame that is politically relevant for a politician is relatively short. And so when you vote for them, what they put on the agenda themselves through their own decision making might be very different from what set of concerns you would put on the agenda through your protest action. And so protest has the effect of changing what is politically relevant for a politician in a time frame that is relevant for them. Kevin says, okay, but everything that goes through and passes is voted on. So in general, voting does more, but protesting is more involvement for those inside the government or those not inside the government. And Martha says, eventually the international opinion is important. Jackie says, Kevin, how likely were they to vote on that without protest to begin with? Jackie, you know, coming in with that important point that voting and protesting matter, but sometimes protesting is necessary to change the agenda so that the voting is voting on issues that you want to vote on, right? And so I think that this is sort of a good place to end, where we kind of recognize the value of both, but that we acknowledge ultimately that protest and collective action can be especially effective in changing the agenda when politicians themselves don't have the right incentives, and when they don't face a set of choices and a set of costs that can really change their electoral fate and their future and their survival. And so thank you everybody for being here. I think this was a really useful discussion. We got a good insight into a couple different cases, and ultimately we had a good analytical debate about protest and voting. I'll see you next week. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and thank you for being here.